The Russia-Ukraine war is perhaps the most geopolitically important event in our lifetimes, yet it's also one of the most misunderstood. While many people today think this war began out of nowhere in 2022, the true roots of this conflict go back decades, and the causes of the conflict involve much more than just Ukraine and Russia. America, the United Kingdom, and NATO have their fingerprints all over this war from start to finish. Before and since 2022, NATO governments led by the United States have poured hundreds of billions of dollars into the Ukrainian government. As of today, we can say that this is a true proxy war between Russia and the leading members of NATO. Those aren't just my words. The new US Secretary of State Marco Rubio admitted this.
And frankly, it's a proxy war between nuclear powers, the United States helping Ukraine and Russia.
The extent of American involvement is to such a high degree that it may be more accurate to call this the Russia-America War than the Russia-Ukraine War. Therefore, knowing the history of the relationship between Russia and the United States in recent decades is of paramount importance to understanding this conflict. Many people trace the origins of the war to the 2014 Maidan Revolution, which overthrew the pro-Russian government of Ukraine and installed a pro-NATO one.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve.
But the origins of this conflict actually go all the way back to the Cold War. We cannot understand this war without looking at the whole story from past to present. In this video, you'll see the full picture of the Russia-Ukraine war, and ultimately, who's really to blame. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 after practically all of its constituent republics declared independence. Russia was one of these countries, turning over a new leaf from the Soviet system and ready to try something new. Leadership of the new Russia was taken up by Russian politician Boris Yeltsin, who would lead the country from 1991 to 1999. Yeltsin had a vision: to pursue friendly relations with the US and end hostilities with NATO. Yeltsin believed that under his leadership, Russia would be welcomed with open arms by the Western world. He thought this would lead to a new age of prosperity in Russia. But reality ended up being extremely different from Yeltsin's vision. The dissolution of the Soviet Union left Russia in an extremely weak diplomatic and economic position. In 1992, the Russian Jewish politician Yegor Gadar became prime minister. He pledged to improve the Russian economy through a mass economic privatization policy known as shock therapy. Russia's state industries and social programs were to be rapidly liquidated and sold to the highest bidder. This plan was endorsed by the International Monetary Fund, the US Treasury, and the Clinton administration. As shock therapy was implemented, Western financiers and oligarchs with ties to organized crime used international banking loans to buy out Russian companies at dirt cheap prices. At the same time, Russia was undergoing inflation that depressed the wealth of native Russians, meaning they couldn't realistically compete for shares of the pie. As a result, many today call this period the looting of Russia. Not only did shock therapy fail to improve the Russian economy, Russia entered a full-blown state of crisis. In the 1990s under Yeltsin, Gadar, and other American-supported politicians, Russia's industrial production and national income declined by half. The price of goods skyrocketed, and millions of Russians lost their savings due to out-of-control inflation. This economic crisis came with social crisis. Drug abuse, prostitution, and crime rose to record levels. Simultaneously, life expectancy collapsed to new lows. The doom spiral got even worse in 1994 when terrorists and separatists in the region of Chechnya launched an independence war that killed thousands. You may have seen this meme that states many negative statistics about Russia. This is actually citing statistics from the 1990s, many of which have drastically improved in Russia since then. This meme is deliberately meant to mislead people about modern Russia, but nevertheless, it does show how rough the 1990s in Russia were. By 1996, the Russian Jewish oligarch Boris Berezovsky openly boasted in an interview that he and 6 other bankers controlled over 50% of the Russian economy and most of the country's mass media. The term, the 7 bankers, became popular across Russia as symbolic of the Yeltsin government's corruption. The US ambassador to Russia, William Burns, wrote in a letter in 1994, "Winter in Russia is not a time for optimists, and in some respects the popular mood here mirrors the descending gloom. Born of a mood of national regret over the loss of superpower status and an equally acute sense that the West is taking advantage of Russia's weakness." By the late 1990s, a new rift emerged in American-Russian relations: NATO's eastward expansion. Starting in 1999, Eastern European countries such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary all joined the NATO alliance. This was widely seen in Russia as America reneging on its promise not to expand NATO eastward. This promise was made during negotiations in 1990 over the reunification of Germany. Transcripts of the meetings in Moscow at the time show that US Secretary of State James Baker told Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that there would be ironclad guarantees that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward. The article, NATO Expansion, What Gorbachev Heard, from George Washington University says, US Secretary of State James Baker's famous not 1 inch eastward assurance about NATO's expansion was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev. Discussions of NATO in the context of German unification negotiations in 1990 were not at all narrowly limited to the status of East German territory, and subsequent Soviet and Russian complaints about being misled about NATO expansion were founded in written contemporaneous memcons and telcons at the highest levels. To put it simply, American and NATO officials did tell Soviet officials that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. However, when America was in a stronger position, this promise disappeared. NATO apologists often defend these actions by claiming that there was never an agreement in writing on NATO's expansion eastward, but this ignores the fact that America had deliberately misled and taken advantage of Russia's trust, acting in bad faith and damaging American-Russian relations. There's a saying that you're only as good as your word, and America had broken theirs. Russia may have taken the expansion of NATO more lightly if it weren't for another major event in 1999, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia.
The first bombing of its kind in NATO history. On March 24, 1999, Western nations carried out their threat against Serbia and began the biggest military conflict on Serbian soil since World War II.
This was the first time NATO used military force without the approval of the UN Security Council, and thus international legal approval. This showed that NATO would operate not only as a defensive alliance, but an offensive alliance that had no problem bombing sovereign states it disapproved of. Russia observed all of this and never forgot it. Even the famous Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn decried the action, saying, "NATO has proclaimed to the whole world, might is right. Those who are strong are always right." He added that it was the destruction of a beautiful country in full view of humanity, while civilized governments applaud this. Not only Russia, but many countries across the world opposed these actions by NATO. It was a serious departure from what NATO claimed to stand for, and people would not quickly forget this. As Russia was reeling from the 1990s chaos, in the year 2000, Vladimir Putin became president of the country. Putin began implementing policies very different from his predecessor Yeltsin. He led economic and criminal reforms, including a crackdown against many of the worst oligarchs who had looted Russia in the 90s. Boris Berezovsky, who had bought up Russian media outlets during shock therapy and bragged about how his clique of 7 bankers controlled over 50% of the economy, fled Russia to Britain in fear of a criminal investigation. Yegor Gadar, the prime minister architect of shock therapy, fled Russia to Ireland and later Ukraine. Those who didn't or couldn't flee, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who had bought majority stakes in Yukos Oil Company during the looting, was thrown in prison for 10 years. Keep in mind, he was the richest man in Russia at the time. Putin's crackdown and reversal of shock therapy was the biggest transformation in Russian politics since the fall of the Soviet Union. As the 2000s progressed, the 90s were left behind and the Russian economy and standard of living improved. Life expectancy rose, drug and alcohol abuse fell, and the economy grew. President Putin enjoyed enormous political power and an approval rating of over 80%. You might think that American politicians would be happy that a country in chaos, suffering immense hardship, had successfully recovered itself, but it was the opposite. Despite these successes, distrust between the United States government and Russia only grew. When a new Chechen separatist war broke out in August 1999, the American state openly supported the rebels. The foreign minister of the Chechen separatists, Ilyas Akhmedov, was allowed to visit the US State Department. But even with this American support, Russia successfully put down the revolt and reincorporated Chechnya as part of Russia. It was a major military victory for Putin, and only increased his popularity. Now, let's quickly review. In the decade after the Soviet Union collapsed, America had supported shock therapy policies that demolished Russia's living standards, given moral support to Chechen separatism that often involved terrorism and the death of thousands of Russians, engaged in an offensive war against Yugoslavia without the approval of Russia or the United Nations, and had expanded NATO despite telling Russian officials it would not do that. Despite all of this, when 9/11 happened, Russia still declared full support to the US in fighting terrorism. America didn't seem to care about this gesture of goodwill. In 2004, NATO underwent another round of eastward expansion, this time taking in the Baltic states, Romania, and several other Eastern European countries. In 2005, President Putin complained to American diplomats, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." In February 2007, he delivered a dramatic speech in Munich where he protested the continuous expansion of NATO.
It turns out that NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders, and we continue to strictly fulfill the treaty obligations and do not react to these actions at all. I think it is obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended?
Throughout the 2000s, a new trend began to emerge in Eastern Europe, America backing so-called color revolutions across the region. One of the first of these color revolutions occurred in none other than Ukraine in 2004. This revolution was known as the Orange Revolution. Its goal was to topple the pro-Russian government at the time and install a pro-NATO one. Does that sound familiar? Sources like The Guardian note in 2004, "The campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that, in 4 countries in 4 years, has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes." The Guardian was writing in favor of these color revolutions, but in doing so admitted that they're creations of the American government and are used to topple governments it doesn't like. Nevertheless, in 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine succeeded in bringing the pro-NATO Viktor Yushchenko to power for 5 years. The success of the Orange Revolution set the precedent for future regime change in Ukraine. But that wasn't all. In 2003, the Georgian government was also overthrown by a US-backed color revolution known as the Rose Revolution. Like in Ukraine, it threw out a government that was friendly to Russia and installed one that was pro-NATO. Between 2003 and 2008, the US began arming and training Georgia to engage in war with Russia.
What's the point of all of this?
Just to train them in the fundamentals of offense and defense.
Big overall question, why? Why is the US actually doing this?
Just to, I don't know why.
Allow me to answer that question for him. They were training the Georgian military to attack Russia. Tensions came to a head in 2008 when the Georgian government invaded the pro-Russian separatist region of South Ossetia. Georgian forces attacked Russian peacekeepers, starting a war which Russia decisively won in 5 days. NATO apologists today call this a Russian attack, but the EU investigation into the conflict later concluded that the America-backed Georgian government had started the war. Even the EU concluded that Russia didn't start this conflict. Reuters reported in 2009, Georgia started a war with Russia, a report supported by the EU. As you can imagine, after this debacle between Russia and Georgia, American-Russian relations were at their lowest point since the Cold War. The administrations of George W. Bush and his predecessor Bill Clinton had consistently treated Russia as an adversary. But in 2009, there was a new president taking office. A president who promised hope and change. Maybe this time things would finally be different. Barack Obama came into office in 2009. His administration claimed to want to reset relations with Moscow and put the negative relationship between America and Russia in the past. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and pressed a fake reset button. At face value, this was supposed to signify a new era in American-Russian relations. Hillary Clinton even called it a fresh start. Was this finally the turning point? Sadly, it was not. In actuality, the policy of the Obama administration would be the exact same as every other American administration since 1990, seeking global domination. America was once again doing diplomacy in bad faith. Future events would prove this time starting in the Middle East. From 2008 to 2014, America and other NATO countries such as the UK and France continued backing color revolutions toppling governments across the world. Some of the most famous of these were the so-called Arab Spring, where governments in the Arab world were overthrown left and right. One such example was Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, a Russian ally. The rebels opposing him were directly backed by NATO air support, which bombed and sabotaged Libyan state troops. The US and UK governments had long hated Gaddafi and took their chance to kill him. Gaddafi ended up brutally murdered in the streets, and his country descended into complete chaos which continues to present day. The entire country of Libya was destroyed by NATO, again a supposedly defensive alliance. Another country at this time that faced turmoil from US-backed rebels was Syria, which descended into a civil war that also still continues to this day. While all these color revolutions were happening in the 2010s, another rift emerged between Russia and America-aligned countries. Large cultural differences grew on issues such as family values, Christianity, and LGBT. Between 2000 and 2020, Western countries liberalized social laws across the board. Gay marriage, gay adoption, you name it. America also became the pornography capital of the world, producing more porn than any other country and exporting it. Mass immigration brought America from a 90% white country in the 1950s to a 60% white country in 2020. And today, America is projected to be majority non-white in the 2040s. In Russia, the story was incredibly different. Russia strengthened laws against LGBT, most famously its landmark 2012 anti-gay propaganda law. This law effectively made gay activism illegal in Russia. LGBT adoption was banned, as well as the production and distribution of pornography. Abortion became more restricted, and the state encouraged ethnic Russians to have more children to protect their demographic future. In 20 years, Russia will still be a racially European country, unlike America. Furthermore, Christian identification in Russia actually grew, from 30% in the Soviet era to over 70% by 2014. Many Western countries followed in the same boat as America, becoming pro-gay, pro-mass immigration, and hostile to traditional understandings of religion. The world stage as we know it was set, and it would lead to the Russia-Ukraine war. In 2008, the US ambassador to Russia, William J. Burns, wrote to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, From knuckle-draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. American officials were fully aware that Ukraine joining NATO was something that no one in the Russian leadership could tolerate, whether they be in Putin's circle or his liberal critics. Nevertheless, in 2014, the US government under Barack Obama backed the infamous Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. This revolution overthrew the Russia-friendly government of Viktor Yanukovych and replaced it with a pro-NATO government. John McCain, Victoria Nuland, and other American government officials were literally on the ground in Ukraine cheering as it happened. They didn't even bother to hide their involvement. Just a week before the coup occurred, there was a leaked phone call of Victoria Nuland speaking about the Ukrainian opposition as if she controlled it. When asked about how the EU would react to all of this, she replied, "F the EU."
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
That's how much she cared about European interests. And people listening to this in the EU area should seriously consider that. In response to this coup, the ethnic Russian regions of Ukraine such as Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea immediately rose up in rebellion against the new Ukrainian government. Kiev declared them all to be terrorists and launched what it called an anti-terrorist operation to destroy them. Russia, seeing the opportunity, gladly stepped in to back these separatists and annexed Crimea. Crimea had long been disputed between Russia and Ukraine, and this was seen by Moscow as the chance to settle the issue once and for all. A war began between the Russian-backed separatists of eastern Ukraine and the US-UK-backed government in Kiev. The New York Times reported plainly in 2024, the partnership between the CIA and Defense Intelligence of Ukraine began in late February 2014, so immediately upon the Ukrainian government changing. It was recently revealed in declassified documents that the CIA built 12 military bases on the front lines in Donbass, meaning America was already directly involved in the combat. The leader of the Ukrainian SBU later said these bases were the reason the Ukrainian state didn't collapse. What all this means is that Ukraine was already a total US proxy in 2014. Throughout 2014 and 2015, there were various attempts at diplomatic resolutions to the conflict between Russia and the new Ukrainian government. The most important were the Minsk Accords, which were supposed to halt the fighting and give Donetsk and Luhansk more autonomy as part of Ukraine. But these agreements broke down, with both sides accusing the other of violating them. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who helped facilitate the Minsk Accords, later stated that they were an attempt to give time to Ukraine. One could interpret these remarks to mean that Ukraine signed the Minsk Accords in bad faith. The new Ukrainian government escalated the conflict to new heights by repealing the neutrality clause in its constitution that declared Ukraine would not join any foreign alliances. Ukrainian officials now stated their intention to officially join NATO. From 2014 to 2022, the war between the ethnic Russian regions of Ukraine and the Ukrainian government continued with no end in sight. Many Ukrainians spoke out against the Maidan Revolution, such as the journalist Olez Buzinia and the politician Oleg Kalashnikov. Pro-Maidan partisans on the website Miro Tvorets added dissidents like this to an online kill list where their personal information and addresses were published. As a result, they and dozens of others like them were gunned down in the street or found dead in suspicious circumstances. Even Western publications like Newsweek called for these murders to be properly investigated by Ukraine, but they never were. When Trump came into office in 2017, it was once again thought that things might change, that America and Russia could maybe bury the hatchet. But they didn't. The Trump administration continued very similar policies toward Russia as all of his predecessors. Despite all the false claims that Trump and Putin are friends, Trump as president took many steps to hurt and undermine Russia. His administration first pulled out of a nuclear missile treaty between America and Russia that had been in place since the Cold War. From 2017 on, he also began to actively arm the Ukrainian military. Donald Trump is often thought of as a non-interventionist or a peace president, but the historical record actually shows he's consistently engaged in warmongering actions. Today, he brags about how he sent weapons such as javelins to the Ukrainian government to kill Russians.
In fact, I was the one that gave the javelins. You remember the famous javelins? That was me. That wasn't Obama. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't anybody else. It was me. And they wiped out a lot of tanks with those javelins. And the expression was that Obama gave sheets and I gave the javelins. That was a big deal. That was the beginning when people said, wow, that's something. Well, that was American equipment.
All in all, Trump is really no different from past American presidents. In 2019, the Rand Corporation released a paper titled Extending Russia, which plotted a plan for America to weaken Russia. One of the chief parts of this plan was to continue arming Ukraine and to brainwash Europe into opposing Russia with America. They spoke about using mass media propaganda to turn the Western world into Russian enemies. In the report's section about Ukraine, it openly states in the risks section that Ukrainians could suffer immensely from America getting further involved in the region. They are, quite frankly, cavalier about expending Ukrainian lives to accomplish their goals. So by the time the 2020s rolled around, with Ukraine actively being funded and armed by the United States as they waged war on ethnic Russians, this is probably the moment Russian officials decided they would have to go to war with Ukraine. Ukraine was turning into a militarized anti-Russia battering ram, getting better armed and more dangerous every year. The New York Times confirmed this by releasing an article in 2025 detailing how since 2014, NATO military officials were directly training and arming the Ukrainian military. Finally, in February 2022, Russia entered the war directly on the side of its ethnic separatists. This began the conflict that makes headlines today. As the conflict escalated, NATO countries responded by getting rid of any ambiguity that they were with Ukraine and fully backed it as a proxy against Russia. America alone under genocide Joe Biden sent over $300 billion worth of weapons. It's been declassified that the post-Maidan Ukrainian state was fully dependent on the US militarily and economically. This means that despite the Russia-Ukraine war being framed as a war over sovereignty, Ukraine never had sovereignty to begin with. Russia came out of the Cold War as a new country that could engage in a fresh start. But from the beginning, it was hamstrung by aggressive financiers who wanted to plunder its resources. Then, when a Russian president defeated those financiers, America sought to undermine Russia in every conceivable way it could, whether it be supporting internal rebellions or destroying its allies. And today, Donald Trump has continued the policies of past American administrations, including even engaging in bad faith diplomatic outreach to Russia. Remember Hillary Clinton with the reset button. Secretary of State Pete Hegseth has gone on record telling Europe to rearm to fight Russia so America can focus on China. That is not de-escalation.
The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific. Recognizing the reality of scarcity, as part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front.
Do you hear that, Europeans? America started this war, and now you need to finish it on the front lines. Die fighting Russia, just like the Ukrainians are. Europeans, please don't fall for this. So, who is the main party to blame for the Russia-Ukraine war? It's America. It's always been America. It will continue to be America until the American state ends its policy of seeking unipolar world domination. Russia isn't the country here seeking to dominate the world. And ultimately, what has the Maidan Revolution brought Ukraine? It's essentially been destroyed. And NATO is happy to feed as many Ukrainians to their deaths as it can, simply to hurt Russia. Hundreds of thousands have died, while millions of Ukrainians have fled and may never return. The Ukrainian economy is in tatters, while the Russian economy is growing faster than many European countries. The tens of thousands of sanctions which were meant to destroy Russia failed. The world has observed all of this. In 2024, another US-backed color revolution in Georgia failed. The Prime Minister of Georgia even declared, "There will be no Maidan in Georgia."
In the last 4 years alone, we have seen 2 attempts from overseas to stage and finance a revolution, but both failed. As a result, the 3rd attempt at a revolution will fail too. In Georgia, of course, there will be no Maidan. You know what Maidan has brought to Ukraine? Some people want a repeat of that scenario in Georgia, but there will be no Maidan in Georgia.
And while all this is going on, the American government, for all its attempts at world domination, has disgraced itself in the eyes of the planet with its backing of a genocide in Palestine by Israel. The Russia-Ukraine war didn't start in 2022. The fighting may have started in 2014, but the aggressive anti-Russian policies of America and NATO are the true cause of the conflict. NATO's record stands as follows: engaging in offensive actions against sovereign countries as a self-described defensive alliance, reneging on promises and assurances that were taken in good faith, sponsoring color revolutions that turned stable countries into civil war-ridden craters. The American, British, and French governments have continued all of this, with both Democrats and Republicans in office. So when people ask you, who's to blame for the Russia-Ukraine war? Now you know the answer. This has been Pax, and thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment letting me know your thoughts on all this. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider donating through the link in the description. As always, I will see you in the next video.